What if I told you that in the mountains of medieval Romania, a queen literally removed her own heart and sealed it in a tower? What if I told you that when lightning struck that tower 500 years later, witnesses claimed they could hear her screaming from beyond the grave? And what if I told you that this isn't just another dark fairy tale, but a story buried so deep in history that even the scholars who study it refuse to speak its name aloud? Tonight, we're diving into one of the most disturbing tales ever to emerge from Eastern Europe, a story of a woman who loved so obsessively, so completely, that she chose to mutilate her own body, rather than risk losing that love. A story that ends with an entire bloodline vanishing in a single night, leaving behind only whispers and a tower that locals still refuse to approach after dark. This is the true story of Queen Elisaveta the Heartless. And I promise you, by the end of this video, you'll understand why her name was erased from every official record, and why the church declared her very existence to be heretical. But first, let me ask you something. Have you ever loved someone so much that you would literally die for them? Have you ever been so terrified of losing someone that you would do anything, sacrifice anything, to keep them forever? Queen Elisaveta asked herself these same questions in the year 1437. Her answer would doom not just herself, but every soul who shared her blood. Let's go back to the beginning, to a time when the borders between Wallachia and Transylvania were drawn in blood, and when the Ottoman Empire cast its shadow over every Christian kingdom in Eastern Europe. Elisaveta was born in 1415 as the third daughter of a minor boyard. By all accounts, she was unremarkable in every way except one. She possessed what chroniclers described as an unnatural capacity for devotion. As a child, when she loved a pet bird, she would keep it caged so tightly that it could barely move, claiming she was protecting it from the world. When she befriended other noble children, she would become violently jealous if they spoke to anyone else, sometimes going days without eating until they promised to be hers alone. Her parents, recognizing her beauty but fearing her intensity, arranged her marriage to Prince Radu of Moldavia when she was barely 16 years old. And here's where our story takes its first dark turn. Prince Radu was not just any nobleman. He was known throughout the region for his peculiar tastes. Court records, hidden away in monastery archives, describe a man who collected human curiosities, preserved organs, unusual bones, the severed hands of executed criminals, which he kept in jars of wine. Most disturbing of all, he was obsessed with the human heart, believing that by studying the hearts of others, he could understand the nature of love itself. When Elisaveta first saw his collection, instead of running in horror like any rational person would, she was fascinated. She spent hours in his private chambers, studying his preserved specimens, listening to his theories about how emotions were literally stored in human organs. And slowly, impossibly, she began to believe him. Their wedding night was unlike anything recorded in the annals of noble marriages. Instead of the traditional ceremony, Radu presented Elisaveta with a freshly removed heart from a young girl who had died of lovesickness. He told his new bride that this was what true devotion looked like, that the girl had literally died when her heart broke, and that the organ itself had turned black from the intensity of her feelings. Elisaveta held that withered, blackened heart in her hands and made a vow that would echo through the centuries. She swore that her love for Radu would never die, never fade, never weaken, and then she did something that defies all human understanding. She bit into that dead girl's heart and consumed it. The servants who witnessed this act were sworn to secrecy under pain of death. But one monk, Brother Theodore, managed to record what he saw in his personal journal, writing in code that wasn't deciphered until the 1980s. According to his account, as Elisaveta consumed that heart, her eyes turned completely black, and she spoke in a voice that didn't sound human, promising Radu that she would find a way to love him forever, even beyond death. For the next 3 years, their marriage was a grotesque parody of romantic devotion. Elisaveta's love for Radu became so intense, so all-consuming, that she began to waste away. She refused to eat unless he fed her personally. She wouldn't sleep unless he was watching her. She had a throne built, facing his, so she could stare at him during court sessions, and servants reported that she would sometimes go entire days without blinking, just watching him with those black eyes. But here's what makes this story truly terrifying. Radu, the man who collected dead hearts and studied human organs, was frightened by his own wife, in letters discovered in a sealed vault beneath the ruins of their castle. He wrote to his brother about Elisaveta's behavior, describing how she would sometimes stop breathing for hours at a time, how her skin grew cold to the touch, and how she began to smell like the preservation fluids he used on his specimens. The breaking point came in 1440, when Radu announced that he needed to travel to Constantinople for diplomatic negotiations. The journey would take months, and he would be traveling through dangerous territory, where wives could not accompany their husbands. Elisaveta's reaction was immediate and horrifying. She locked herself in their private chambers for 7 days and 7 nights. Servants who listened at the door reported hearing sounds that couldn't be human, scraping, tearing, and a wet rhythmic pounding that went on for hours. When she finally emerged, she was carrying a small wooden box, and she was changed. The black in her eyes had spread, creating dark veins across her face like cracks in marble. Her skin had taken on a waxy, translucent quality. And most unnaturally of all, she no longer cast a reflection in mirrors. She presented the box to Radu and told him that her heart was inside. She claimed that she had used his surgical tools to remove it from her chest while she was still alive, and that, as long as he kept it safe, her love for him would never die, and neither would she. She could wait for him forever, literally forever. And nothing in this world or the next could separate them. Radu opened the box. Inside was indeed a human heart, still warm, still beating faintly. But it was wrong in every possible way. Instead of the normal red-brown color, it was pure white, like carved ivory. And it was covered in what looked like writing, symbols carved directly into the muscle tissue. Symbols that seemed to move and change when observed directly. That night, Radu fled. He abandoned his castle, his title, his lands, everything. He never returned to Moldavia, and historical records show him dying of a wasting disease in Venice 12 years later. His last words, recorded by a priest, were, "She's still waiting. God help me, she's still waiting." But Elisaveta wasn't waiting in their castle. Oh no, that would be too simple for this story. She had the box with her heart sealed inside a tower that she ordered built on the highest peak in the Carpathian Mountains. The tower was constructed using a technique that historians still can't explain. Instead of mortar, the stones were held together with what appeared to be a mixture of blood, ground, bone, and human hair. The workers who built it were never seen again after its completion. Inside this tower, Elisaveta established what she called her eternal vigil. She would wait there until Radu returned to claim her heart, and therefore her love. The few travelers who encountered the tower in its early years reported seeing a pale figure in white standing at the single window, motionless, for days at a time. Some claimed that even from miles away, they could feel her watching them, and that plants would wither and die in the surrounding area. Years passed. Then decades. Reports of the tower began to take on an even more sinister tone. Local villagers spoke of hearing a woman's voice, singing lullabies that would drift down from the mountain on windless nights. Hunters reported that animals would refuse to enter the area around the tower, and that those who got too close would return speaking of a terrible cold that seemed to seep into their bones. But the most disturbing reports came from people who claimed to have seen Elisaveta herself. Unlike the still figure in white that early travelers described, witnesses in the later decades spoke of something that was no longer entirely human. They described a woman whose body seemed to be held together by will alone, whose white dress was stained with something that might have been blood or might have been something worse, and whose face had begun to collapse inward as if she was slowly consuming herself from within. The Catholic Church attempted to intervene twice. The first expedition, led by Father Marcus in 1473, returned with only 3 survivors out of 12 men, These survivors refused to speak of what they had encountered, but all three died within a month of their return, and their bodies showed signs of having been drained of blood. The second expedition never returned at all. By the early 1500s, local authorities had declared the entire mountain region to be cursed land. Maps began to omit the tower entirely, and the few references to Queen Elisaveta in official records were systematically destroyed or altered to remove any mention of her name. But the tower remained, and so did she. For over 400 years, Elisaveta maintained her vigil. Generations of mountain dwellers grew up with stories of the Heartless Queen, and smart travelers learned to take routes that would keep them well away from her domain. Those who were foolish enough or desperate enough to approach the tower reported increasingly disturbing encounters. By the 1700s, witnesses described a figure that barely resembled a human woman. Her white dress had become part of her body, growing into her flesh like fungal threads. Her face had collapsed entirely, leaving only hollow sockets where her eyes had been, yet somehow she could still see. Most horrifying of all, the singing had changed. Instead of lullabies, travelers reported hearing what sounded like hundreds of voices all singing different songs simultaneously, creating a cacophonous chorus that would drive listeners to madness. And through it all, that box containing her heart continued to beat in the highest chamber of the tower. Locals claimed you could hear it on quiet nights, a slow, steady rhythm that matched no human pulse, echoing across the mountain valleys like a funeral drum. The end came, as endings often do, without warning. On the night of October 13th, 1847, a massive storm struck the Carpathian Mountains. Lightning, more intense than anything in recorded memory, turned the sky white for hours. And when the most powerful bolt struck Elisaveta's tower, something that had been waiting for over 4 centuries finally happened. The tower exploded. Not collapsed, not crumbled, but exploded outward as if something inside had been building pressure for hundreds of years and finally burst free. The sound was heard as far away as Bucharest, described by witnesses as a scream that seemed to come from the earth itself. A sound of such pure anguish and rage that it shattered windows in villages 50 miles away. But here's the truly inexplicable part. That scream, that impossible sound of 400 years of obsessive love and supernatural hate finally being released, didn't stop when the tower fell. It continued for 6 days and 6 nights, echoing through the mountains, growing weaker, but never quite fading entirely. When search parties finally reached the ruins, they found something that defied all explanation. Instead of stone blocks and mortar, the debris consisted entirely of what appeared to be crystallized bone and hair. And at the center of the destruction, where the highest chamber had been, they discovered a crater filled with a white, waxy substance that locals claimed was still warm to the touch. Of Queen Elisaveta herself, they found no trace. No bones, no clothing, no physical remains of any kind. But embedded in the rock face where her window had been, searchers discovered something that still gives historians nightmares. Carved deep into the stone, as if etched by fingernails over the course of centuries, were thousands upon thousands of words in a language that no scholar has ever been able to translate. The only recognizable element was a single name, repeated over and over again, Radu. But the story doesn't end with the tower's destruction, because something else died that night. Something that makes this tale even more chilling than the obsessed queen and her centuries-long vigil. Every single person who could trace their bloodline back to Queen Elisaveta died on the exact same night the tower fell. Not just her direct descendants, but distant cousins, people who shared even a drop of her blood. Individuals scattered across Eastern Europe who had no idea they were connected to the Heartless Queen. They all died at the exact moment lightning struck that tower, and they all died the same way. Their hearts simply stopped beating. Medical examinations, as primitive as they were in the mid-1800s, showed that their hearts hadn't just stopped. They had crystallized, turning into the same white waxy substance that filled the crater where Elisaveta's tower had stood. In a single night, an entire bloodline vanished from the earth, as if some cosmic force had decided that whatever corruption had infected Queen Elisaveta needed to be completely eliminated from the human gene pool. The few scholars brave enough to investigate this phenomenon came to a conclusion so disturbing that most of them destroyed their research rather than publish it. They theorized that when Elisaveta removed her own heart and sealed it in that tower, she had somehow bound the life force of everyone who shared her blood to her supernatural existence. As long as she maintained her impossible vigil, they lived. But when her obsession finally consumed even her undead form, when for centuries of waiting finally destroyed whatever was left of her humanity, the connection was severed violently. Fatally, she had loved so completely, so possessively, that she had literally claimed ownership of the blood that flowed through her family's veins. And when she was finally released from her self-imposed torment, she took them all with her. Today, if you know where to look in the archives of certain Romanian monasteries, you can find fragments of this story. But you'll notice something interesting about these records. Every single one of them contains a warning, written in multiple languages, advising readers never to speak Elisaveta's full name aloud, never to visit the site where her tower once stood, and never, under any circumstances, to attempt to locate the remains of her heart, because according to these warnings, her story might not be over. Local mountain guides still refuse to take travelers near the ruins of the tower. They claim that on certain nights, when the moon is dark and the wind is still, you can hear that slow, steady heartbeat echoing across the valleys. The same rhythm that witnesses reported for over 4 centuries, the sound of a heart that was removed from its body but refused to die. And sometimes, they say, if you're foolish enough to listen carefully to that impossible heartbeat, you can hear something else mixed in with it. The sound of a woman's voice, still singing, still waiting, still calling a name that no one living remembers. The Catholic Church maintains that Queen Elisaveta's soul was destroyed along with her tower. That whatever supernatural force had sustained her unnatural existence was finally purged from the world. But the Orthodox monasteries in Romania tell a different story. They believe that some forms of love are so twisted, so consuming, that they transcend even the boundaries between life and death, between the human and the monstrous. They believe she's still waiting. And if you ever find yourself in the Carpathian Mountains on a night when the air is still and the darkness seems deeper than it should be, if you hear the slow, steady rhythm of a heartbeat carried on the wind, remember this story. Remember Queen Elisaveta, who loved so completely that she removed her own heart to preserve it, who waited for centuries for a man who had fled in terror, who bound the lives of her descendants to her supernatural existence. Remember her, and whatever you do, don't follow that sound, because some towers may fall, but the hearts they contained might still be beating somewhere in the darkness, waiting for someone foolish enough to come looking for them. And that's a love story that no one should ever want to be part of. The queen who hid her heart in a tower became the queen who hid her heart in legend. A cautionary tale about what happens when devotion becomes obsession, when love becomes possession, and when a human heart refuses to accept the natural boundaries of life and death. Her dynasty ended in a single night, just as our story promised. But endings, as Queen Elisaveta herself proved, are sometimes just the beginning of something far worse.